David was walking down a busy street, his thoughts lost in the day's events. He was heading to the corner store when a police car suddenly pulled up beside him. A tall, white officer stepped out of the car, his uniform crisp and clean. The officer's eyes scanned David up and down, as if he was looking for trouble. David didn't know why the officer stopped him. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but he had a feeling that something bad was about to happen. The officer, whose name was Officer Williams, didn't waste any time. Without asking David anything or explaining why he was being stopped, he started speaking to him in a harsh tone. "What are you doing around here?" he asked, his voice full of suspicion. David tried to stay calm, even though he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't want trouble, especially not with a police officer, but it seemed like the officer wasn't interested in hearing his side of the story. "Just walking," David said politely, hoping to keep things peaceful. But Officer Williams wasn't satisfied with that answer. "Walking, huh? You sure you're not up to something?" he sneered. He took a step closer, his face filled with a mix of anger and judgment. David felt his chest tighten as the officer's words cut into him. The officer's eyes seemed to say it all. He was treating David like he didn't belong there, just because of the color of his skin. David knew that people like Officer Williams saw him as nothing more than a stereotype. It wasn't the first time he had been treated this way. He had grown used to it, even though it always made him angry. But today, it felt different. It was like the officer was purposely trying to humiliate him, to make him feel small in front of everyone around. "Are you some kind of thug, huh? What's your deal?" Officer Williams continued, his voice rising. David could feel the eyes of nearby people on him now. Some looked curious, others seemed uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up. It was just him and the officer. David felt the heat rise in his cheeks, but he didn't want to make the situation worse. He stayed quiet, his hands clenched by his sides, trying not to react. The officer was enjoying the power he had in that moment. He didn't care how David felt. He was only interested in showing who was in control. David's heart raced. He had been through moments like this before, when an authority figure treated him like he was less than human, simply because of the way he looked. It hurt, but he had learned how to keep it inside. He couldn't afford to show weakness. David's mind raced, wondering what would happen next. The officer wasn't letting up. Every word from his mouth felt like an attack. But David didn't say anything back. He just stood there, taking it, hoping that the officer would eventually lose interest. But that didn't happen. Instead, Officer Williams kept pushing, getting closer, his voice full of insults and contempt. David knew he had to get out of this. He had to move on, even if it meant swallowing his pride. So without another word, he turned and started walking away. His heart was still pounding, and he felt his face flush with a mix of shame and anger. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been treated like less than a person. But he kept his head down and kept walking, trying to put the whole experience behind him. Little did David know, just 2 minutes later, his life and the officer's would take a dramatic turn. David walked away from the officer, his footsteps quickening as he tried to leave the situation behind. But no matter how fast he walked, the anger from the encounter stayed with him, clinging to his thoughts like a shadow. His chest felt tight, and his mind replayed the officer's words over and over again. What did he mean by that? Why did he treat me like that? David couldn't stop thinking about it. He had always been taught to rise above, to stay calm. But the stain of being humiliated so openly felt worse than he expected. He kept walking, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his head lowered. David didn't even realize where he was going. His thoughts were a storm, swirling with frustration. He had tried so hard to do the right thing, just walking down the street, minding his own business. But now it felt like everything was falling apart. The weight of being judged, of being seen only for the color of his skin, was heavy, even though he had experienced it many times before. Each time it felt different, like a wound that was never fully healed. As he walked, David looked around at the people passing by. Most of them seemed lost in their own worlds, unaware of what had just happened to him. Some walked with their heads down, avoiding eye contact, while others moved quickly, either not noticing the tension in the air or just choosing to ignore it. No one stepped forward to say anything. David wasn't surprised. People rarely did. It was easier to pretend like nothing was wrong. David felt isolated in that moment. The world around him seemed too quiet, too indifferent to what had just happened. The officer's cruel words echoed in his mind. "Thug, what's your deal?" It made him angry to think that people like Officer Williams saw him as a problem before even getting to know him. That's all it ever was, a judgment based on a look, a judgment that David couldn't escape, no matter how hard he tried. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. The anger was burning inside him, but he couldn't let it control him. He knew if he let it get to him, it would only make things worse. He needed to let go of the pain, but that was easier said than done. How do you let go of something that hurts so much? How do you forgive someone who made you feel so small, so unimportant? The truth was, David wasn't sure if he could forgive Officer Williams. Not yet. As David walked, he tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on his steps and the ordinary things around him. The sound of car engines, the chatter of people talking on the phone, the smell of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe. But no matter how hard he tried to distract himself, the incident kept coming back to him, like a replay button he couldn't turn off. Why didn't I say something? Why didn't I stand up for myself? These thoughts bounced around in his head, making him feel even worse. He hated feeling weak, like he couldn't stand up to the officer's cruelty. But the truth was, David had made a choice to stay calm. He didn't want the situation to escalate, especially not when it involved someone in a position of power. But now, in the quiet of his thoughts, David wasn't sure if he had done the right thing. His mind was still racing when he turned a corner and suddenly froze. The sounds of the street disappeared, replaced by the screech of tires and the sound of a loud crash. David's heart skipped a beat. He looked up, and there, just a few feet away, a police car was spinning out of control. It slammed into a traffic light, its back end hitting the sidewalk, and the car came to an abrupt stop, smoke rising from the hood. David's eyes went wide in shock. The car had rolled over, and he could barely make out the figure inside. It was Officer Williams. David stood frozen for a second, unable to process what had just happened. His first instinct was to run, to get away from the accident. But something deep inside told him to stay. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was because he realized that, despite everything, he couldn't let someone suffer, even if that someone had just humiliated him. He looked around, but no one else was rushing toward the wreck. People were standing off in the distance, too scared or unsure to act. Without thinking, David's legs moved on their own, rushing toward the overturned patrol car. This wasn't about forgiveness or revenge. This was about saving a life. David didn't know what he was about to do, but he knew he had no choice. He ran toward the officer, his heart pounding in his chest. David's heart was racing as he approached the wrecked police car. The scene was chaotic. Smoke billowed from the engine, and the sound of glass crunching underfoot filled the air. The police car had been flipped over, its wheels spinning aimlessly. For a moment, David couldn't tell if the officer was still alive. The car was crumpled in all the wrong places, and it seemed like it could explode at any second. But something inside David told him he had to move quickly. He couldn't just walk away. He reached the car and saw Officer Williams, still unconscious, slumped against the seat. Blood was dripping from his head, pooling onto the dashboard. David's breath caught in his throat. The officer's face was pale, and his eyes were closed. David hesitated for a split second, thinking about how this man had just moments ago humiliated him, taunted him with racist insults. But in that moment, all that mattered was whether or not the officer would survive. David quickly surveyed the situation. The car door was jammed. probably from the impact, but there was no time to waste. He had to act fast if he wanted to save the officer's life. David looked around, but there was no one else nearby. People had stopped to watch, but they weren't helping. A wave of anger washed over him. Why was everyone standing around, staring, while someone's life was at risk? Shaking off his frustration, David realized he needed to focus. He took a deep breath and tried to calm his racing thoughts. His training in basic first aid, learned years ago, kicked in. He knew that the officer needed help right away, or he might not make it. First things first, he had to stop the bleeding. David found a cloth in his jacket pocket and pressed it against the officer's head, trying to stop the flow of blood. He could feel the officer's pulse, faint but steady. That was a good sign. The officer was alive. That was all that mattered. As David worked quickly, trying to assess the officer's condition, he noticed that the man's breathing was shallow and uneven. Panic started to rise in his chest. What if I can't save him? He thought. But he pushed the fear down. This wasn't about him. It was about the officer, about saving a life. David continued to work, trying to keep the officer stable. He checked the man's neck for any sign of injury that could be more serious. The officer's eyes remained closed, and his breathing seemed to become more erratic. David looked around, hoping to see someone else who could help, maybe a paramedic or someone with more experience. But the street was eerily quiet. It felt like hours, even though it had only been a few minutes. The only sound was the officer's labored breathing and the distant hum of passing traffic. David's hands were shaking, but he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The officer's life was in his hands now. Finally, David couldn't wait any longer. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. His voice was shaky when he spoke, but he gave the operator clear directions to the accident site. A police officer is hurt, badly. I need an ambulance now, David said, his voice urgent. He's still alive, but he needs help fast. As soon as he hung up, David went back to the officer's side. He could feel his anxiety growing, but he didn't let it show. He had to stay strong for this man, for someone who, just moments ago, had treated him like nothing. It felt strange, caring for someone who had humiliated him. But David knew that in life and death situations, personal feelings had to be set aside. He kept pressure on the officer's head wound, hoping the paramedics would arrive soon. Every second counted. David wasn't sure how long it would take for help to come, but he refused to leave. He wouldn't abandon the officer, not when he had the chance to save him. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. Just when David thought he couldn't take the waiting any longer, the sound of sirens finally reached his ears. Relief washed over him, but it wasn't over yet. The paramedics needed to take over, and David had to trust them with what he had done. As the ambulance pulled up, David stepped back, watching as the paramedics rushed to the officer's side. They worked quickly, taking over the treatment that David had started. The officer was carefully lifted onto a stretcher and moved into the ambulance, his condition still critical but stable. David stood there, watching the ambulance drive away, his heart still racing. He didn't know what would happen to the officer. All he knew was that, in that moment, he had done the right thing. David stood on the sidewalk, his hands still trembling from the intense experience. The ambulance was gone, the sound of its sirens fading into the distance. He was alone now, surrounded by the quiet buzz of the city. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, and his thoughts were catching up with him. As the minutes passed, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. David had saved Officer Williams' life, but he couldn't shake the mix of feelings swirling inside him. His mind kept returning to the officer, how just a short time ago, the man had humiliated him, treating him like a criminal for no reason at all. David could still hear the officer's harsh words in his head. "What are you doing here? You sure you're not up to something?" Those words had stung, and they were hard to forget. How could someone who had treated him like that be the same person David had just saved? The question bounced around in David's mind, and he couldn't find an easy answer. He tried to make sense of it, but the truth was, there was no simple explanation. On one hand, he felt a deep sense of justice. The officer had been cruel, but David couldn't let someone die. He wasn't a person who would walk away from someone in need, no matter what had happened before. Yet, on the other hand, David felt a sense of frustration building up inside him. Why should I care about someone who treated me like dirt? The question kept echoing in his head, and he couldn't stop it. David started to walk again, his steps slow and heavy. The city around him looked the same, but it felt different. His mind wasn't on the streets or the people around him. It was on the officer and the choice he had made. Did I do the right thing? David asked himself. He had acted without thinking, instinctively running to help, but now that the moment had passed, he wasn't so sure. The officer had shown him nothing but disrespect, and yet David had treated him as if his life mattered. He thought about how many times he had felt the sting of injustice. He had lived through countless moments when people looked at him differently because of the color of his skin. In some ways, it had hardened him, made him cautious, even bitter at times. He had learned to expect the worst from people, especially from authority figures. That's why what had happened earlier with Officer Williams felt like a slap in the face. But saving him, that felt like something David couldn't fully explain, something beyond the anger he felt. As David walked, he found himself wrestling with a deeper question. Why did I do it? He wasn't some hero. He wasn't out to prove a point or to earn praise. The moment had been about doing what was right, but that didn't make the feelings of injustice go away. It didn't erase the humiliation, either. He could still feel the weight of the officer's words, the way they had made him feel small, less than. But still, he had acted. Why? David had a sinking feeling that it wasn't as simple as just doing the right thing. There was something deeper at play, something about how people were willing to look past differences in times of crisis. Maybe he had helped because, despite all the hate and judgment, he still believed in the humanity of others. Maybe he wanted to prove to himself that he was better than the cruelty he had faced. He stopped for a moment and looked up at the sky. It was a bright, sunny day, and the world around him seemed to move on as if nothing had happened. But for David, everything had changed. The encounter with Officer Williams had left him questioning himself, his actions, and the world around him. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was shifting in him. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone. A message from his friend, Jasmine, flashed across the screen. "Are you okay?" David stared at the message, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over him. Jasmine had been a rock for him in the past. She knew what he had gone through, knew the struggles he faced every day. David typed a quick response, trying to shake off the confusion and frustration swirling inside him. "Yeah, I'm good. Just had a long day." He hit send, but the truth was, he wasn't sure if he was good at all. The question of what to do with this strange mix of emotions was still hanging over him. He didn't know the answer, but he knew one thing. His actions today had opened up something in him that he couldn't ignore. Later that evening, David found himself sitting in his small apartment, staring out the window at the city lights. His mind was still racing. The events of the day, helping Officer Williams, the way the officer had treated him before, played over and over in his thoughts. It felt like a weight he couldn't shake off. David had done what he thought was the right thing, but now that it was over, the confusion lingered. He picked up his phone and stared at the message from Jasmine. "Are you okay?" It was simple, but it made him pause. Jasmine had always been there for him, always understood the struggles he faced as a black man in a world that wasn't always kind. She knew what it felt like to face judgment and to be treated unfairly by people who didn't know you. She knew the frustration that came with constantly having to prove you're worthy of respect, even though you've done nothing wrong. David typed a quick reply. "Yeah, just thinking a lot. I'll be fine." But even as he hit send, he knew he wasn't fine. He was far from it. The truth was, he didn't know how to feel. He wasn't sure if what he had done for Officer Williams was out of kindness or something deeper. Maybe he had saved the officer's life because he knew that was what a good person should do. Or maybe it was because, deep down, he wanted to prove to himself that he was better than the cruelty that had been shown to him his whole life. His phone buzzed again, this time a call from Jasmine. He hesitated before answering, not sure what to say. When he picked up, her voice was steady but concerned. "David, you're not okay, are you?" she asked gently. David sighed, rubbing his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know what I'm feeling." "You helped him, right?" she said, like it was simple. And maybe to her it was. "You saved his life, David. That's a big deal." But David couldn't get past the fact that the person he had saved had treated him so badly just hours before. The injustice of it all made his chest tighten. "He humiliated me, Jasmine. He treated me like I wasn't even a person," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "And then I go and save him. It feels wrong." Jasmine was quiet for a moment, probably thinking about what to say. "Look, I get it. I really do," she finally said. "But in that moment, you did what was right. You didn't let his bad actions make you do the wrong thing. That's the hardest part, choosing to do the right thing, even when you're hurting." David listened to her words, letting them sink in. It was hard to accept, but Jasmine was right. He hadn't done it for praise, or because he was trying to prove something. He had acted because someone's life was at stake, and in that moment, it didn't matter who the person was or what they had done before. What mattered was that David made a choice to save him. But still, the feeling of anger lingered. How could someone who wore a badge, someone who was supposed to protect and serve, be so cruel to him just because of his skin color? It was hard to understand, even harder to accept. "I just don't know if I can forgive him for how he treated me," David said softly. "You don't have to forgive him right away," Jasmine replied. "But I think you should give yourself some credit. You showed him kindness when he didn't deserve it. That's not something a lot of people could do." David sat back, feeling a bit lighter. Maybe it wasn't about forgiving the officer right away. Maybe it was about understanding that sometimes doing the right thing wasn't easy, and it didn't always come with a clear answer. He looked out the window again, watching the city as it moved on, just like always. The world hadn't stopped because of what he did. The noise, the traffic, the lights, it was all still there, moving without any care for the small moment of change David had just experienced. But inside, something had shifted. David didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had taken a step in the right direction. The next morning, David woke up early, the sunlight streaming through his bedroom window. His mind was still heavy with the thoughts of the day before. He hadn't slept much, the weight of the decision he had made lingering like a cloud over his head. As much as he wanted to put it all behind him, something told him that wasn't going to be easy. He knew he couldn't just forget about what had happened. After getting dressed, David decided to take a walk. He needed to clear his head, to sort through the mess of emotions he was still tangled in. The world outside seemed so normal, like nothing had changed. People were walking by, going about their day, and cars honked in the distance. It was the same scene as always, but for David, it felt different. There was a weight to the air, a heaviness that wasn't there before. As he walked, he thought more about Officer Williams. He couldn't stop wondering if the officer remembered him. Did he even know who had saved him? What if he didn't? What if he didn't care? The questions seemed endless, and David didn't know how to answer them. But one thing was certain. The officer was alive because of him. That fact alone had changed something in David, even if he wasn't sure what it was yet. He passed a coffee shop and decided to stop for a moment. He didn't really need the coffee, but the idea of sitting down for a few minutes seemed comforting. Inside, the smell of fresh brewed coffee filled the air. David ordered his drink and sat by the window, watching the people outside, lost in their own worlds. His phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. He glanced at it and saw a headline: "Police officer involved in car crash recovers after heroic rescue." His heart skipped a beat. It was about Officer Williams. The article mentioned the crash and how the officer had been saved by a passerby. David. For the first time since the accident, David felt a rush of pride, but it was mixed with a sense of unease. The article didn't mention his name, just that a brave civilian had saved the officer. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that the officer was okay, that the choice David had made had saved a life. The words "heroic rescue" stood out to him, but it didn't feel like a hero moment. It felt like the right thing to do, something anyone in his position would have done. Still, as David read through the article, his stomach churned. The story didn't mention the officer's actions before the crash, the way he had treated David just hours earlier. There was no mention of the racism, the cruel words, or the way he had looked at David like he was a threat. It felt like the officer's story was being rewritten, like he was being portrayed as a victim of an accident, not someone who had caused harm with his words. David leaned back in his chair, letting out a frustrated sigh. The world had a way of ignoring the truth when it didn't fit the narrative. People would read the article and think that Officer Williams was a hero, someone deserving of sympathy. They wouldn't know the whole story. They wouldn't understand what had really happened. But David also realized something important. He didn't need the world to understand. He didn't need anyone's approval. The choice he had made, to save the officer's life, wasn't about what other people thought. It was about him. It was about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. David stood up from his seat, finished his coffee, and left the cafe. As he walked back to the street, he felt a shift inside him. The anger and confusion were still there, but they weren't consuming him like before. Maybe that's what he had been looking for: peace, not in the world's approval, but in his own understanding of what it meant to be true to himself. He didn't know if he would ever fully understand Officer Williams' actions, or if he could ever forgive him. But for now, David was okay with that. What mattered was that he had made the right choice, and that was enough. A few weeks had passed since the accident, but the memory of that day still lingered in David's mind. Life had returned to its normal rhythm. He went to work, met up with friends, and tried to shake off the feeling that something had changed inside him. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't forget about Officer Williams, or the way his world had collided with David's. David had been keeping track of the news about the officer's recovery. According to reports, Williams was doing better, and people were praising him for how well he had bounced back from the crash. David still felt a strange unease when he saw the headlines. The officer was being painted as a hero, someone who had overcome a near-death experience. It bothered him that people seemed to forget the way he had treated David before the crash, how quickly the past could be forgotten, and how easily a person could be made into a hero when the circumstances were just right. One evening, as David was walking home from work, he saw a familiar face. It was Officer Williams, standing near a street corner, talking to a group of people. David's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he wondered if the officer had seen him. Williams didn't seem to notice, caught up in his conversation. David's first instinct was to keep walking, to avoid the awkwardness of facing the man who had humiliated him. But then something in him stopped. David found himself standing still, staring at the officer from a distance. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Maybe an apology, maybe an acknowledgement of what had happened. But Officer Williams didn't seem to notice David at all. He was talking and laughing, the picture of someone who had moved on from the crash, as if nothing had ever happened. David felt a knot tighten in his stomach. It was hard to put into words, but the moment felt wrong. He had saved this man's life, but here he was, acting as if David was invisible. The pain of being dismissed, of having his actions ignored, rushed back to him. Was this how it always went? Would he always be the one to step in and help, while others went on with their lives as if nothing had changed? He felt the familiar sting of frustration rising up again. But this time, it wasn't as sharp. Instead of feeling angry, he felt a strange sense of clarity. David understood something in that moment. He had saved Officer Williams because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected anything in return. The officer might never acknowledge him, might never understand the weight of what had happened, but that didn't matter. David had made a choice based on his own values, not on the hope that others would see it or thank him for it. David took a deep breath and turned away, walking down the street without a second thought. The officer's voice faded behind him, but it didn't matter. He didn't need validation. He didn't need the world to give him credit. The truth was, he had acted out of kindness, and no matter what anyone else thought, that was enough. As David walked, he realized that he was finally at peace with his decision. He wasn't a hero, and he didn't need to be. He was just a person who made the right choice in a difficult moment. That was enough for him. And for the first time in a long time, David felt like he could let go of the anger, the confusion, and the frustration. He had done something good, and that was all that mattered.